So here you are, you're probably growing really fast. And as an engineering leader, you're trying to figure out how do you balance the tension between doing things that are just good enough for right now, and then figuring out how do you then optimize that process and scale that process in a more effective way. So the big question is, how do you design a hiring process for your engineering org that will scale as you grow, and where are the best places to spend your time, effort, and budget? So now we have optimizing and scaling hiring processes. So let me introduce you to our speakers that will help guide us through this topic. So we have Catherine Miller joining us, and she's the VP of Engineering at Flatiron Health. We have Vinithra Varadharajan, Head of Platform Engineering at Airtable. And we have Keng He, Senior Director of Engineering at LiveRamp. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. How are you?
Hello, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, we'll take it away. The floor is yours, and dive on in, Keng.
Yeah, sure, of course. I think when we talk about hiring and scaling and optimizing, as engineers, we'll first ask, okay, what is the current scale, right? So Vinithra and Catherine, could you give us like some sense of like what is the size of your engineering team at your current company right now?
Sure. Airtable is currently at 120 engineers, and a significant portion, about 40 to 50% of that was hired during this remote time of the past year.
We're about 300 engineers, roughly, and we did have a period of scaling where we were doubling every year for a number of years.
All right. So Vinithra, so for 120 engineers, I'm curious about what does the hiring process look like? What are the stages and sessions that you have?
Yeah. So we have a great recruiting team who we partner with. And so we have sources who help with the sourcing. Then we do some pitch calls to understand the candidate better, and sometimes that's an engineering manager. Next is a phone screen or a take-home exercise, depending on what the candidates prefer. And then there's the on-site. And sometimes we do, especially in this time of everyone being remote, we are also able to support 2-day on-sites, so you can split your full round. So yeah, and then it's a debrief and offer and sell calls.
Got it. What about you, Catherine?
Yeah, it's really similar. I'd say that we typically only do sales calls for sort of senior candidates because at a high volume, it can be quite overwhelming. But very similar process, including kind of splitting up the evals potentially and doing reverse interviews after we've extended an offer.
Got it. Got it. So generally speaking, we want to avoid premature optimization. So what are some of the early signs that indicates, oh, it is time to optimize, or oh, it is time to scale, the current process does not work for us?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. So the way I think about hiring process, and like especially when it comes to scaling hiring process, is that you want to think of 3 things. One is efficiency. So are you valuing everybody's time, the interviewers, the recruiters, and most importantly, the candidates' time? Next is, are you able to hire for the profile that you want? And the last thing is the candidate experience. So when you think about all of this, so when you start to get a sense of one of these things is not fitting, then that's kind of like a signal. But to break it down a little bit, typically of course, if your hiring needs go up by an order of magnitude, then that's obviously the first sign. If interview load is high and you get complaints from your interviewers, then that's another. And the most poignant is that you're unable to close recs in time. While previously you were able to, get all your engineers, you were able to close your recs, and you didn't have to think too much of the process, and it worked for you. But now suddenly your backlog is pretty high, then that's your signal.
Got it.
I'm going to argue maybe a little bit more extreme position, which is I think there's actually no time that premature optimization is possible here. Or to say it another way, as soon as it's possible that you will have an interview loop that is not exactly the same people that's been on every other interview loop, you should consider scaling your processes. And I think that because you start to immediately get inconsistencies in the way that you've built out your process, and I don't think you have to do all of the possible scaling things right away. But as soon as it's not just you and your founding friends doing the interviews, I think it's time to start putting process in place and building out what the scaffolding for your structure will look like.
Right. I do think that consistency is like something very important, right? Like once we do have like 20 interviewers or 50 interviewers in the interview process, and how do we make sure that different interviewer panels like calibrate with each other and hold the same hiring bar for the candidates that go through the pipeline? So Catherine, I'm wondering if you have like some particular like tips and tricks, or like how do you make sure the bar is the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of tactics here. So the first is really to have structured interviews. So the more that your interview itself is structured, the questions are standardized, and your competencies are clear. Now you at least have a situation where your interviewers are at least trying to interview for the same thing, and now you might just have a calibration issue. Part of what you can do for calibration is make sure that people are shadowing, reverse shadowing on interviews before you set them loose in the wild by themselves. And then something that really helped us, especially in the early days, was having a hiring committee where people actually sat around a table and discussed every candidate. So there is still obviously a hiring manager making the decision, but particularly when you're thinking about being in that maybe 15 to 20 engineer category, it means that every engineer is going to hear a lot of that discussion and get kind of calibrated even just by hearing what that conversation is and the thoughts in the hiring manager that the hiring manager expresses. So I think those are three kind of easy techniques to start helping on this process.
Vinithra, do you have anything to add here? What about your process there?
Yeah, a lot of similar things. I think what Kat was referring to are like debriefs where the engineers are involved, and then there's a separate hiring committee. One of the things that we do at Airtable is that we do write down the arguments for why we should hire an engineer. And also the most important part in that is the leveling. So assuming you do already have levels and internal strata within the engineering organization, then thinking about who fits under what level is an extremely important and nuanced discussion. And so being able to write it out, and of course, you're going to be able to standardize that as you get many more data points. But having that written down is a really useful exercise.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. So I think the engineering leveling is something that like could be used for many different purposes within the organization. But I'm wondering if you implement some sort of a scorecard, like candidate scorecard rubric, and they say, oh, for this particular session, we are assessing this like 5 or 6 different traits. And for those traits, like what does good mean? What does bad mean? Like just curious about like, do you do those rubrics, and does that help?
I think it's essential. I think those rubrics evolve over time, so they've definitely gotten more rigorous over time. But I think that when I talk about competencies, that's a lot of what I mean. Like, this is what we're looking for. This is what doing well at algorithms means, or doing well at problem solving means. Here are the things that we're looking for. Here are the things we're not. And for our technical questions, we also break down sort of how much progress is good, what kind of hinting is acceptable, those kinds of things.
So at Airtable, I've seen an evolution of, so initially the panels were all decided. So the focus areas was agreed on. However, we didn't have detailed rubrics until very recently. And that came about because, again, our scale, and we had to really standardize it. And the debriefs were not enough of a standardization across the multiple groups that were emerging within engineering. At Cloudera, it was quite different in that it was somewhat, it depended on the engineering manager, the hiring manager a lot. And so over there, the standardization happened at the hiring manager level, and it became more of a, how do you standardize across that particular group? And that had pros and cons in terms of what a candidate of one group we had to put in some improvements in place so that a candidate of one group could also operate on another group, and like that group welcomes them with confidence.
Right. So we talk about, I think like a lot of this involves training the interviewers and sometimes like training the hiring managers, right? And especially for interviewers, like sometimes the interviewers need to shadow multiple sessions and then learn about the whole interview skill sets before they become, hey, I can be the interviewer for this like particular panel. Like curious about like sometimes engineers are like, I just come in and want to code and then develop product. I don't want to do the interview. And as the company grow, there are times it's just like we cannot find enough interviewers to do the interview. How do you encourage the interviewers, the engineers to interview? Vinithra, maybe you can take this first.
Yeah. So we haven't had too much of an uphill battle in my experience because engineers care about who they work with. So they do welcome participation or their own participation in it. If there's one of the things that might be is that there's apprehension. So training goes a long way. The other part is that you do have you can offer different modes of interviewing. So do you want to be part of the phone screen or the take home or the on-site, different focus areas? Typically what I've found is engineers would prefer to pick a particular topic and stay focused on that from candidate to candidate. That also helps them calibrate for their own question and their way of asking the question. And lastly, I would say acknowledging the time that they put in, putting a cap on the number of interview hours, taking into consideration that they have to also spend time to write things out, and so on.
Got it.
I'm going to actually say we've taken the very extreme approach of saying, why would you make it optional? Everyone is required to do interviews. We don't require them right away. We want people to onboard successfully without worrying about that. We want them to get to know our company and be able to talk about it. So typically it's 6 months to a year before they join. But I actually think that it's a potential problem if you allow people to self-select, because then you get the people who are most enthusiastic about the company and sort of your best cheerleaders interviewing, which sounds great. But then they're also taking that time away from their day-to-day work, and maybe they're going to suffer on the performance review side because they haven't been able to do as much engineering work. So I think it's like very important to spread that around to everyone and not make it a purely optional opt-in thing. Though I will second, you should absolutely have maximums. Ours used to be 4 a week, which was really heavy, and that's part of the reason we had to make it mandatory, is we needed every hand on deck.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. And now, I don't think that like everyone will make a very, very good interviewer, right? When it comes like sometimes, like do you when you bring people in, right? Like do you say, hey, is this a good communicator? That does the candidate actually have like interviewer like traits, right? Because for some of the candidates that for some of the interviewers, they may be a little bit shy. They may be a little bit of like like not paying too much attention on the interviewer part. Things.
Well, interviewing isn't an inborn trait any more than being a good engineer is an inborn trait. It can be learned. And so I reject the belief that there are people incapable of becoming good interviewers. There are people who stalwartly refuse to become good interviewers. I will acknowledge that. And sometimes you have to figure out a solution for that. I've absolutely had to tell people, like, your job is to be nice. Like, you need to make people feel comfortable. And that is your job. You are not their adversary. You're actually their biggest proponent in this moment. You're trying to give them the best possibility to succeed. So I've literally had to tell engineers like very basic things about like how to be friendly to others. But again, I think that is actually a really valuable skill for them to learn and to evolve. And I do not believe that you should, for us anyway, we're not going to hire people who don't have the ability to at least learn that skill over time.
Good point.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is interviewing is part of the engineering culture. So who you hire is also who you make your future interviewers. So I'd say that if you're watching out for people who do care about the larger company, who do care and who have put in an effort to improve their communication skills and build that over time, then that's going to also reflect in interviewing. To Kat's point, it is important that engineering managers and hiring managers consistently emphasize that what we're looking for is we want to find what the candidate's strengths are rather than seek out all their negatives. If you're on a hunt for that, then that in itself is going to be, the candidate is going to feel judged and nobody performs well under those circumstances.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if I'm a candidate on the other side of the table, I would feel like, hey, the interview session is a collaborative session, right? It's more like working with a future colleague rather than, oh, I'm being judged all the way throughout the process. So speaking of the interviewer panels, I'm curious that do you have like one panel per hiring team, or do you have like a shared panel across the entire org or team? Kathleen, maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, we do centralized hiring, and I feel pretty strongly that there's a lot of benefits to it. So what we have is a shared interviewer resource across the entire engineering org, so across all sort of 300 roles that we have. Mm-hmm. And then we have senior leaders who are designated as hiring managers, but again, they're mostly hiring into a general pool of individuals that we will then match to teams. This is a little bit different for particular senior roles. So if I'm hiring a director, I might actually be the hiring manager for it, but I can still I don't necessarily have only my team doing that interviewing, and I would actually potentially leverage other hiring managers. It has an obvious downside that, if you're hiring someone to a general pool, you maybe have less ability to advocate for, oh, this is a T-shaped candidate, but I think they'll work really well on my team. Mm-hmm. So it does require everyone in that position to be aware of what teams exist at the company and what kind of strengths and weaknesses might play in those different spots. There might be some teams that really do well with systems people who are really good at systems. Other teams might do really good with data engineers. And so there is some need to do that, but it allows so much standardization and also means that the teams that are on fire aren't asked to then take on the extra load of getting themselves not on fire, which I think is a really important benefit.
So I do have a follow-up question there, like in terms of the matching process, right? And we all know that time to hire is like a measurement, like very important. Like some candidates only in the market for like 2 to 4 weeks, right? Once the time's gone, the candidate's gone from the market. And adding a team matching process in between definitely adds the time there. So is there any tips on how you can manage that process to make it very efficient?
Well, for us, we extend the offer simultaneously with team match, and the team match can potentially happen after they arrive at the company. So it's a little bit candidate preference. So for very senior engineers who have a very particular skill set, they might need to match before they join, but otherwise we actually do a post-hiring team match process. And this is something you can get away with when you have a lot of open headcount, and less so when you have very little open headcount.
I see. Vinithra, what about the panel process?
So at Airtable, the only streams that we have are based on skill sets, so full stack, front end, or back end. And so your interview panels themselves will be based off of that. The matching happens at the start. So right from the sourcing, we try and decide which team is a candidate interested in, and the team is also is a good fit. This is based on like our priority of recs. But this isn't a tight match right at the beginning. Over the course of the interviews, especially sometimes, there are a few recs, all those recs get filled up by the time the interview, like the on-site is done. So either for that reason or the candidate's preference changes over time, we can revisit the team matching thereafter. And so we do have a good system in place. Like we have understandings with the different groups and the recruiters involved to be able to do these quick, they understand when a team has openings and they can move people around pretty quickly. So to your point, yes, we try not to spend any time as part of that.
I see. So it seems like in this case, the candidate have some indications or hints on which team he or she will be on, right? And in Kathleen's case, it's just like if I were a candidate, I have no idea which team I'll go into, but I know that I'm going. It's going to be like one of the engineering teams, like within Flatiron Health, and then only until like, oh, I passed the interview, then I can pick and choose.
Yeah, and I have to say, like, things change really fast. So an opening that exists the day you started interviewing may not exist the day your offer is extended. And so that is part of the equation here too, is that, you know, when things change rapidly, you need to be able to adapt rapidly.
Got it. Got it. So what are some of the key metrics that you are looking at or you keep track of to measure the efficiency of the hiring process that you have at your company? Vinithra?
Yeah. Oh, so I'd say, you know, like with anything to do with measurement, the sooner you start, the better. So we measure, so for example, time in every stage of the pipeline. And so this is so that we can keep improving our own efficiency, diversity stats, again, at every stage of the pipeline. Interviewers scores themselves so that we can see how, like, what's the average score that an interviewer gives, and is that higher or lower compared to other interviewers. You can do this even by question, and so this also enables you to give quantitative feedback to different interviewers.
Got it. Catherine, what about Flatiron Health?
Yeah, I mean, that all sounds right. I think just to elaborate on the sort of the funnel metrics, totally agree about looking at diversity at every stage. And one of the things you're looking for here is just the drop off between every stage. So you want to see volume, but you also want to see drop off, and you want to see drop off by sort of demographic factors as well. And that's an important indicator.
So sometimes, like, we focus a lot on the engineering side of the house, right? And then our partners are also recruiting, right? And do you have any thoughts or kind of ratios on, like, hey, how many recruiters do I need, right? Or like how many sources or coordinators like do I need in the organization? Like maybe there's a magic ratio between recruiter and number of openings. I'm just curious, like, how you think about this.
Well, all recruiters are not created equal. I think that this is actually the thing that you're trying to adjust for with your metrics. If you see that you are unable to bring in enough to the top of your funnel, then you probably need more sourcers. If you find people lingering in different stages of the funnel, then it might mean either that you don't have enough capacity to interview, or that you don't have enough basically candidate lead support in order to be able to schedule interviews. If you're losing a lot of people at the end, you know, maybe you don't have enough recruiters to close, or maybe there's something wrong with your process. So I don't think there's a magic ratio, because people are different and situations are different. But I do think this is where your metrics can help you.
Yep, I'd say something similar. Also, to a certain extent, it depends on the variety of profiles you're looking for. So in this quarter, for example, our focus is senior full stack engineers. So then it's that one sourcer can just stay dedicated on that profile and generate a whole bunch of leads. Versus if I need both backend and full stack of different levels, then that just makes the matrix more complex, and then they're going to spread themselves thin. So you might want to just spread it across two sourcers.
So, I mean, in the remote world, right? How the remote changes like everything that we just talked about here in terms of the process, the efficiency, and all that. How does it impact?
I love the remote world. I think that when it started, we were all very trepidatious, like how we'll be able to evaluate people, because we are not a fully remote company, and we weren't even particularly hybrid before this. And I think there was a lot of worry, how will I evaluate people? There are some interviews that frankly do still suck. When you want to be able to whiteboard a design diagram and you don't have the right tools, that can be really hard. But there's a lot of advantages. I've loved, you know, Vinithra mentioned the being able to spread something over 2 days instead of 1 day. The ability to not have to have candidates fly in. You know, I think that there's actually been a ton of advantages. In fact, you know, people getting sick and being able to swap them out easily, like I'm actually currently trying to figure out how much of this we can keep as we go back to in person.
Yeah, we put together some prep docs for the candidates themselves to help them, because while we might have gotten the practice by now of interviewing people remotely, they might not yet be there. So it's the more of the what to expect, so to speak. And also, of course, always audiovisual issues, like technical issues. what do you do when these things happen? So just having backups and helping them prep ahead of time.
Cool. And I think we are at time, and then we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. And thank you so much, Catherine and Vinithra. It's a great conversation. I learned quite a lot from this. Patrick.
Yeah, incredible conversation. We had a few questions come in from the audience. The first one, who owns the top of the funnel? Is it the hiring manager or the people team? And this comes from Rajesh Agarwal from our community.
So in our case, recruiting does own top of the funnel. However, there is for every new job rec that we put out, or job description that we put out, we do have a calibration session, a discussion between the sourcers and the hiring manager to really get precise on the kind of profile that we're looking for.
Is that the same for you, Kat?
Yeah, I'd say agreed, but then I'll also say that the hiring manager is somewhat responsible for holding recruiting accountable. So there's a give and take there, but definitely recruiting owns filling the funnel.
And I'll add to that to say that one of the biggest success that we've gotten, really been able to scale, is to give that feedback, have really tight feedback loops with your recruiters and sources and build a really trusting relationship across that.
Yeah, I second that. I do think the trust and the collaboration between the recruiting team and hiring managers are critical to this. For example, the top of funnel, sometimes the hiring managers will need to jump in and look at, hey, how did you actually write that email that gets sent out to the candidates, right? If we tweak a few words here and there and then make it more technical, maybe it's more appealing to the engineering audience, right? So it is a collaboration between both two.
A quick follow-up question about the mechanisms of those feedback loops. Is it regular meetings? I guess what's the mechanism that you introduced to keep that consistent?
Yeah, we do have regular syncs, and I found that most tactical things can be discussed asynchronously, actually, to say hey, what do you think about this candidate, and so on. The more interesting discussions are, one, observations of what sources and recruiters are observing about the market, and so that we can react quickly to it. Secondly is inefficiencies. I think a bulk of the discussions we've been having lately is can we tweak this? Can we tweak that? And it's always a dialogue.
Yeah, huge +1 to that. And I'd say we also do QBRs that do focus around those metrics and those funnels, so that you've got the kind of regular touch points for the how can we sort of incrementally improve, and then you have these occasional big picture snapshots of are we where we need to be and what do we have to change?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I think the name of the game is predictability, and so especially when it comes to metrics and scale, is that do you have everything, because everything is a month or two delayed out. Any improvement you make now it's going to take some time to manifest. So being able to predict what your end results are and scaling back from that to make the improvement ahead of time.
That's so true. The long arc of the feedback loop there. One more quick question, Kat. This is more specific to some of the processes that you were sharing specific to Flatiron. How do you mitigate a candidate who maybe feel so I think the person is if somebody's priority is the manager, that's important to them as part of the decision-making criteria, how do you mitigate maybe that consideration through your process? Is that an objection or thing that you deal with ahead of time? I think somebody was curious to know if that's an important consideration and that shifts throughout the process, how do you manage that concern sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, that's actually one that I haven't heard a lot. What I hear more is, especially with senior candidates, hey, I really have this technical skill and I want to make sure that there's a project that's appropriate for me. So we do to some extent, we try to suss that out early in terms of the candidates and understand. A lot of candidates actually love the idea that they get to kind of shop around. So it's actually a selling point in many cases. But for candidates who really want to be sort of put somewhere, then we'll do that selling process rapidly at the end. Once we've extended an offer, we'll do a rapid couple of reverses. We'll have them pick and go from there. And typically that only adds, it's a couple of days turnaround on that. It's usually not that onerous.
Okay, so it still sounds like there's a little bit of that calibration conversation at the end to make sure that it's a good fit for them and making that work.
Yeah, if that's the thing they need to know in order to be able to say yes, then it behooves us to give them the options, have them meet the managers and make their own decision about whether this is the right place for them.
Great, thank you. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions. Keng, Vinithra, Kat, thank you three so much for an incredible conversation and sharing your insights here. I know that it's been really effective for our community. So thank you three.
Thank you.
This was great.
Awesome. We'll see you soon.